Welcome to Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, 18,000 acres of hell on earth. This maximum security prison farm sits on a former slave plantation, surrounded on three sides by the Mississippi River and endless Louisiana swampland. Named after the African homeland of the enslaved people who once worked these fields, Angola is now America's largest maximum security prison, home to over 5,000 inmates and 55 condemned men waiting to die on death row. 90% of prisoners sent to Angola will never leave alive. They'll die here and be buried in the prison cemetery with a simple wooden cross marking their graves. This is the story of death row at Angola, where men spend decades in cells smaller than your bathroom, waiting for the state to kill them. In March 2025, Louisiana broke a 15-year execution hiatus with a controversial new method, nitrogen gas. What you're about to witness is the brutal reality of life and death inside Louisiana's Alcatraz of the South. Subscribe now for more death row documentaries from America's most notorious prisons. Hit that notification bell. Jessie Hoffman Jr., 46 years old, Louisiana Department of Corrections death row inmate, convicted of the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 28-year-old advertising executive Mary Molly Elliott in 1996. Hoffman was 18 when he committed his crime. He forced Elliott to drive to an ATM, withdraw money, then drove her to St. Tammany Parish, where he raped her and shot her execution style on a dock near the Middle Pearl River. A duck hunter discovered Elliott's body on Thanksgiving Day. Hoffman spent 29 years on death row at Angola, converting to Buddhism while incarcerated, becoming a father figure to his son from prison, and by all accounts transforming into a completely different person from the teenager who committed murder. None of that mattered. On March 18, 2025, at 6:50 p.m., Louisiana executed Hoffman using nitrogen hypoxia, making him the first person executed in Louisiana in 15 years and only the fifth person in American history killed by nitrogen gas. Tonight, we examine his final day and the death row system that ended his life. Angola's history is inseparable from slavery and racial oppression. The prison sits on land that was once the Angola Plantation, named for the African country where enslaved people were stolen from their homeland and brought to Louisiana in chains. After the Civil War, former Confederate Major Samuel Lawrence James acquired the lease to Louisiana State Penitentiary and implemented convict leasing, essentially re-enslaving black men under a different name. Most black inmates were subleased to plantation owners to replace freed slaves. They were worked to death in the fields, building levees and railroads, while white inmates received clerical work. Prisoners died by the hundreds under brutal conditions. In 1901, the state purchased the Angola property from the James family and converted it into Louisiana State Penitentiary. The prison operated as a plantation until the 1970s, with armed guards on horseback supervising inmates working cotton and sugarcane fields. Today, inmates still work the fields at Angola. The architecture of slavery remains intact, only the names have changed. Death row at Angola consists of 8 tiers lettered A through G, with 15 cells on each tier except one with 11. Each cell measures 6 feet by 9 feet, smaller than most parking spaces. Inside, a metal bunk, a stainless steel toilet, a small sink, and nothing else. The death row facility was constructed in 2006 without air conditioning or cross ventilation. In Louisiana's brutal summer heat, temperatures inside cells regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In 2013, 3 death row inmates filed a federal lawsuit alleging unconstitutional conditions due to extreme heat. Federal judges ordered temperature monitoring, which confirmed the inhumane conditions, but executions continued anyway. Until 2021, death row inmates were held in permanent solitary confinement, meaning 23 hours per day in their cells, with 1 hour for showering, phone calls, or exercise in outdoor cages. Thanks to a historic lawsuit led by Cardozo Law School Civil Rights Clinic, Death row inmates now receive a minimum of 4 hours of congregate time 7 days per week. It's still hell, just slightly less isolated hell. Before we examine current death row, we must understand the Angola Three: Robert Hillary King, Albert Woodfix, and Herman Wallace, 3 Black Panther members who spent decades in solitary confinement at Angola, accused of killing prison guard Brent Miller in 1972. Woodfix and Wallace were convicted despite wavering witnesses and zero physical evidence linking them to Miller's death. They spent over 40 years each in solitary confinement, the longest period of solitary confinement in American prison history. Prison officials claimed they kept Woodfix and Wallace isolated because they subscribed to Black Pantherism and might incite prison uprisings. Robert King was convicted of a separate prison murder and spent 29 years in solitary before his conviction was overturned. All 3 maintained their innocence. Herman Wallace was released in 2013, 3 days before dying of liver cancer. Albert Woodfix was finally released in 2016 after his conviction was overturned. Even Miller's widow came to doubt their guilt, stating, "If they didn't do this, and I believe they didn't, they've been living a nightmare." December 1999. A failed escape attempt at Angola resulted in the beating death of corrections Captain David Knaps. 5 inmates were involved in the violent takeover attempt, taking several hostages, but only Captain Knaps died. The inmates became known as the Angola Five. Of the 5 participants, only David Brown, the sole black participant, and Jeffrey Clark received death sentences. The other 3 received lesser sentences despite participating in the same crime. David Brown was tried by an all-white jury. His defense attorneys later argued that prosecutors withheld evidence showing Brown didn't know about the plan to kill Captain Knaps. A conversation between 2 other inmates allegedly revealed this information, but it was never presented to the jury. Brown's case made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to hear it. David Brown remains on death row at Angola today, one of 55 condemned men awaiting execution. His case exemplifies the racial disparities that plague Louisiana's death penalty system, where black defendants face execution while white co-defendants receive life sentences for identical crimes. Not everyone on death row is actually sentenced to death. Many Angola inmates serve life without parole, which longtime Angola journalist Wilbert Rideau called worse than the death sentence. Lloyd Bones. Bone has been imprisoned at Angola since 1971 for killing another man in a knife fight. He was convicted of life without parole. "I'm never leaving here," Bone told a photographer documenting Angola. For decades, Bone has served as the driver of Angola's horse-drawn hearse, transporting dead inmates to the prison graveyard. Angola buries over 40 inmates per year in its cemetery. Most have no family willing to claim them. Some inmates even build their own coffins in the prison woodshop, knowing they'll eventually occupy them. The cemetery contains rows and rows of simple white crosses, each marked with an inmate number. 80 to 90% of prisoners admitted to Angola will die within the prison grounds and be buried there. Lloyd Bone will one day make his final trip in the hearse he's driven for so many years, transported by another lifer to another anonymous grave. March 18, 2025, 6 a.m. Jesse Hoffman wakes in his death watch cell for the last time. He's been moved from regular death row to a special observation cell closer to the execution chamber. A corrections officer sits outside his cell continuously, documenting his every movement. Hoffman barely slept. How could he? In approximately 13 hours, Louisiana will strap him to a gurney, place a full-face respirator mask over his face, and pump pure nitrogen gas into his lungs until he suffocates. The method is called nitrogen hypoxia. Alabama used it 4 times before Louisiana adopted the protocol. Witnesses to Alabama's nitrogen executions described inmates shaking, gasping, convulsing as oxygen deprivation shut down their bodies. Louisiana officials insist the method is painless. Hoffman's Buddhist spiritual advisor disagrees, arguing that forcing Hoffman to wear a mask that prevents meditative breathing violates his religious freedom. Federal judges issued a preliminary injunction to stop the execution. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned it. Now, Hoffman sits in his death watch cell, counting down the hours, wondering if last-minute appeals will save him. They won't. As Hoffman sits in his death watch cell, his attorneys are fighting desperately in multiple courts simultaneously. Cecilia Capel, director of the Center for Social Justice at Loyola University College of Law, files emergency motions arguing nitrogen hypoxia violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. She presents expert testimony that nitrogen gas causes superadded pain and terror compared to other execution methods. U.S. District Judge Shelley Dick agrees and issues a preliminary injunction blocking the execution, finding that nitrogen hypoxia likely violates the Eighth Amendment. Louisiana Attorney General Liz Murrill immediately appeals. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, dominated by conservative judges, vacates Judge Dick's injunction, ruling that Louisiana can proceed. Capel files an emergency appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. At 9 a.m., the Supreme Court rejects the stay request 5-4. Justice Neil Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, joins the three liberal justices in dissent, criticizing the Fifth Circuit's failure to address Hoffman's religious freedom claims. The dissent doesn't matter, for justices aren't enough. The execution will proceed as scheduled. Not everyone in Molly Elliott's family supports Hoffman's execution. Kate Murphy, Elliott's sister-in-law, sends a last-minute letter to Governor Jeff Landry and Attorney General Murrill begging them to spare Hoffman's life and commute his sentence to life in prison. Executing Jessie Hoffman is not justice in my name. It is the opposite, Murphy writes. She asks for the opportunity to meet with Hoffman as part of her healing process. Governor Landry ignores her plea entirely. Attorney General Murrill dismisses Murphy's letter, stating that Molly Elliott's immediate family members did not oppose the execution moving forward and were grateful to have finality. The division within the victim's family reveals an uncomfortable truth about the death penalty. It doesn't necessarily bring closure or healing to victims' loved ones. Some family members need vengeance. Others need dialogue and understanding. The state chooses vengeance every time, regardless of what individual family members actually want. Kate Murphy's voice is drowned out by officials insisting they're executing Hoffman for the victims. But which victims? The ones who want him dead, or the ones begging for his life to be spared? At noon, Hoffman is asked for his last meal request. Louisiana limits final meals to $40 and ingredients available in the prison kitchen. Hoffman declines. He won't eat a special last meal. Perhaps food holds no appeal when you know you'll be dead in 6 hours. Perhaps refusing the meal is a final act of control over a process designed to strip him of all autonomy. At 2 p.m., Hoffman makes his final phone calls. His son, Jesse Smith, was just a newborn when Hoffman went to prison. Smith has been raised by his father from death row, communicating through letters, phone calls, and prison visits for his entire life. The 15-minute call is recorded and monitored. What do you say to your father when you know he'll be dead in 4 hours? What does a father say to his son when he's about to be executed? Outside the prison, Smith joins protesters rallying against the execution. He holds signs. He gives interviews to reporters. He begs for his father's life. Inside the death watch cell, Hoffman hangs up the phone and sits in silence. We're halfway through Hoffman's final day. Drop a comment. Should Louisiana have executed Hoffman after 29 years? Hit that like button if this story is gripping you. By mid-afternoon, over 100 people gather outside Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. Anti-death penalty activists hold signs reading state-sanctioned murder and thou shalt not kill. Buddhist practitioners set up a meditation area, preparing for evening prayers. Allison McCrary, director of Louisiana Interfaith Against Executions, speaks to media gathered outside the prison gates. Death is an irreversible punishment. Once you take a life, you can't take it back, she tells reporters. And knowing that we get it wrong 80% of the time, Louisiana is determined to take this risk. A woman identified as Hoffman's sister sobs audibly under a nearby tree. Jessie Smith, Hoffman's son, addresses the crowd with tears streaming down his face. Promise of Justice Initiative attorney Samantha Porcio condemns Governor Landry's bloodlust, noting that while many Louisiana residents can't afford groceries, the state is spending countless resources to kill one man. Pro-death penalty supporters are notably absent. The only people who showed up to witness Hoffman's execution are those begging for his life to be spared. Inside the prison, Hoffman is unaware of the protests. He sits in his cell, counting down the final hours. At 3 p.m., Warden Darrell Vanoy visits Hoffman's death watch cell to review the execution protocol. Vanoy was appointed Warden of Angola in 2024 after previously serving from 2016 to 2021. He's overseen executions before. He explains the procedure to Hoffman in clinical detail. At 6 p.m., Hoffman will be escorted from the death watch cell to the execution chamber in Camp F. He'll be strapped to a gurney with chest, waist, arm, and leg restraints. A full-face silicone respirator mask with a plexiglass screen will be placed over his face. The mask creates a virtually airtight seal against his skin. Pure nitrogen gas will flow through an industrial tube into the mask. The one-way inlet valve allows gas in but prevents oxygen from entering. Hoffman will inhale pure nitrogen, gradually depriving his brain of oxygen until he loses consciousness, then dies. The protocol calls for nitrogen to flow for at least 15 minutes or 5 minutes after his heart rate flatlines, whichever is longer. The entire process should take approximately 20 to 30 minutes. Vanoy asks if Hoffman understands. Hoffman nods. In 3 hours, he'll be dead. At 4 p.m., Hoffman's Buddhist spiritual advisor arrives for a final visit. The advisor sits outside the observation window, speaking to Hoffman about Dharma, about suffering, about the Buddhist concept of death as transition rather than ending. Hoffman has practiced Buddhism for years while incarcerated. Meditation and mindful breathing are central to his practice. The respirator mask that will kill him directly interferes with that practice. His attorneys argued this violates the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Federal judges dismissed the argument. The Fifth Circuit ruled that every execution method involves psychological terror and that nitrogen hypoxia doesn't cause physical pain. Therefore, it's constitutional. The distinction between psychological suffering and physical pain is academic to Hoffman. Both hurt. Both terrify. The spiritual advisor leads Hoffman through breathing exercises, helping him find peace in his final hours. Outside the prison, Buddhist practitioners conduct a meditation vigil, attempting to send Hoffman spiritual support as he faces death. Inside his cell, Hoffman breathes deeply, practicing the meditative breathing that has sustained him for years, knowing that soon a mask will cover his face, and those same breaths will kill him. Louisiana's death penalty system is plagued by racial bias. Of the 55 men on death row at Angola, a disproportionate number are black. Studies show that defendants accused of killing white victims are far more likely to receive death sentences than those accused of killing black victims. All white juries, like the one that sentenced David Brown, routinely sentence black defendants to death. Prosecutors use peremptory challenges to remove black jurors from capital cases. Defense attorneys receive inadequate funding to mount effective defenses. Many capital defendants suffer from intellectual disabilities, brain damage, childhood trauma, and mental illness. But these mitigating factors are ignored by juries eager to impose death. Louisiana has one of the highest exoneration rates in the country. Damon Thibodeau spent 15 years on Angola's death row before DNA evidence proved his innocence and freed him in 2012. Michael Ray Graham Jr. and Albert Ronnie Burrell were exonerated from death row in 2001 after prosecutorial misconduct and jailhouse snitch testimony led to their wrongful convictions. Jimmy Duncan spent 27 years on death row before a judge granted him bail in 2025, citing discredited bite mark analysis and charlatan expert witnesses. How many innocent men has Louisiana executed? We'll never know. 5 p.m. 1 hour until the execution window opens. Hoffman sits alone in his death watch cell. The observation guard watches him through the window, documenting his behavior in the log. Hoffman appears calm on the outside. Inside, his mind races. He thinks about his son, about the life he could have lived if he hadn't made terrible choices at 18. He thinks about Molly Elliott, about her final moments of terror, about her family's pain. He's written letters of apology over the years. He's expressed genuine remorse. He's become a different person. None of it matters now. In the execution chamber, the execution team prepares the equipment. The gurney is checked. The restraints are tested. The respirator mask is examined to ensure an airtight seal. The nitrogen gas canister is confirmed operational. The phone line to the governor's office is verified in case a last-minute stay arrives. No stay is coming. At 5:30 p.m., witnesses begin arriving at the prison. Media representatives, prison officials, and notably absent, members of Molly Elliott's family who support the execution. The witness rooms fill. Everyone waits. Inside his cell, Hoffman meditates, breathes, prepares to die. 6:12 p.m. The door to Hoffman's death watch cell opens. Jessie Hoffman, it's time, Warden Vanoy says quietly. Hoffman stands. His legs are shaking. Guards place him in handcuffs and leg restraints. They escort him the short distance from the death watch cell to the execution chamber in Camp F. The walk takes less than 30 seconds. It feels like an eternity. Hoffman enters the execution chamber, a small sterile room dominated by the gurney in the center. He lies down voluntarily. The tie-down team works quickly and efficiently. Chest strap, waist strap, arm straps extending his arms in a crucifixion position. Leg straps. The restraints are tight. Hoffman can barely move. One of the execution team members approaches with the respirator mask. It's larger than a typical medical mask, industrial grade, designed to create a perfect seal against the face. The team places it over Hoffman's face, adjusting the straps to ensure no oxygen can leak in. Hoffman's breath echoes inside the mask. His heart pounds. The curtains covering the witness room windows remain closed. Behind the one-way mirror, the execution team waits for the warden's signal. In the witness rooms, 15 people sit in silence, waiting to watch a man die. The curtains open. Hoffman sees the witnesses through the glass. He sees media representatives with notebooks. He sees prison officials. He sees his son's empty chair. Jessie Smith couldn't bring himself to watch. Warden Vanoy enters the chamber. Jesse Hoffman, Jr., you have been sentenced to death by the state of Louisiana for the murder of Mary Molly Elliott. The sentence will now be carried out. Do you wish to make a final statement? Hoffman declines. He has no final words. Perhaps there's nothing left to say. Perhaps the mask already covering his face makes speech too difficult. Perhaps he simply wants it to be over. At 6:31 p.m., the warden nods to the execution team behind the mirror. Pure nitrogen gas begins flowing through the tube into the respirator mask. Hoffman breathes normally at first. Then his breathing becomes rapid, panicked. His body convulses involuntarily as oxygen deprivation begins shutting down his brain. The convulsions continue for several minutes. Witnesses shift uncomfortably in their seats. This is supposed to be painless. This doesn't look painless. After approximately 5 minutes, Hoffman's body goes still. The nitrogen continues flowing. 15 minutes. 20 minutes. Finally, at 6:50 p.m., the prison physician enters with a stethoscope. The physician checks for heartbeat, checks for breathing, checks pupil response. At 6:50 p.m., exactly 19 minutes after the nitrogen began flowing, he makes the official pronouncement. I declare this inmate deceased. Jessie Hoffman Jr. is dead. Warden Daryl Vanoy steps into the media briefing room where reporters wait. The execution of Jessie Hoffman Jr. has been carried out, he announces. It was flawless. It went about as good as we expected it to be. Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Public Safety and Corrections, Gary Westcott, echoes this assessment. Flawless, he repeats. Witnesses who watched Hoffman's body convulse might disagree with that characterization. Attorney General Liz Murrill releases a statement calling the execution justice for Mary Molly Elliott, her friends, her family, and for Louisiana. Governor Jeff Landry issues his own statement. If you commit heinous acts of violence in this state, it will cost you your life. Plain and simple. Hoffman's attorney Cecilia Capel releases a counterstatement. Tonight, the state of Louisiana carried out the senseless execution of Jessie Hoffman. He was a father, a husband, and a man who showed extraordinary capacity for redemption. Outside the prison, protesters weep. Hoffman's sister collapses in grief. The vigil continues long after Hoffman is declared dead. Jessie Hoffman's body is removed from the gurney, taken to the prison morgue, then released to his family for burial. He won't be buried in Angola's inmate cemetery. He's the first person Louisiana executed in 15 years, but Attorney General Murrill promises he won't be the last. We have to look at how we can move these cases along, she tells reporters. Yes, we expect to move more of them forward, at least for this year. 55 men remain on Angola's death row, waiting for their turn in the execution chamber. Louisiana spent 15 years unable to obtain lethal injection drugs. Now they have nitrogen gas. The executions will resume. The death penalty debate continues. Does execution deter crime? Studies say no. Does it bring closure to victims' families? Kate Murphy's plea suggests not always. Does it risk executing innocent people? Louisiana's exoneration rate proves yes. Is it applied fairly? The racial disparities prove no. Does it cost more than life imprisonment? Significantly more due to mandatory appeals. Angola will continue housing death row inmates in sweltering cells without air conditioning. They'll continue dying at rates of 40 per year and being buried in the prison cemetery. And Louisiana will continue executing them with nitrogen gas, calling it justice, while families on both sides suffer. This is America's death penalty in 2025. Nothing has changed except the method. That's the reality of death row at Angola, Louisiana's 18,000-acre plantation prison. Subscribe for more death row documentaries from across America. Comment below. Should Louisiana continue executing death row inmates with nitrogen gas? What about the racial disparities in the system? Check out our other videos on Alabama's nitrogen executions and Texas death row. Thanks for watching this difficult but important story.